To get more on this, we're joined by SABC News correspondent Trent Murray, who joins us now on the program. Thank you so much for your time, Trent. Great to have you on the program. So this is an important meeting for the G7 leaders. What can we expect from this gathering?
Yeah, it is. It comes at a really critical time for world affairs, doesn't it, both diplomatically and economically. And flying in to join these discussions, President Cyril Ramaphosa, we know his South African Air Force jet touched down in Munich in the last few hours. He's arrived to discuss some of those key issues on the agenda with other G7 leaders. The main ones we expect to include the war in Ukraine, obviously very much overshadowing discussions, and the knock-on effects of that war, including food security. And we know the US has said in recent days it believes there's around 25 million tonnes of grain currently stuck in Ukraine, a lot of that destined for Africa and the Middle East. And so President Ramaphosa's office is saying that going into these discussions, he wants to speak about food security in particular and advocate not just on behalf of South Africa, but on behalf of the African continent as a whole. Other key issues we expect to be discussed include climate change, as well as record inflation, which is affecting economies across Europe and especially the US, as well as just the cost of living. We heard a briefing overnight from the German government here talking about the cost of bread in many parts of the world. They gave the example of Zimbabwe. They said until recently a loaf of bread there cost the equivalent of around $1. It's now $1.40, a very real world example of how the ripple effects of that war in Ukraine are really now starting to hurt people well beyond the immediate region of the conflict zone.
Now, Trent, the meeting comes at a time where the war is still raging in Ukraine. Are we likely to hear the leaders speaking in one voice on how to end this war?
I think it will be really central to the discussions because I think G7 leaders here know that watching this conference will be President Vladimir Putin. He will be looking for signs of whether there's any cracks in the unity amongst those major democratic nations that are really propping up Ukraine right now with military support and economic aid. Certainly going into this weekend, both the German hosts and the White House have been talking up very heavily the need to make sure that that support for Ukraine remains. We know Boris Johnson of the UK is going to argue particularly hard for making sure military support continues and that there's no concessions given to Russia. There's some softening we're starting to see in parts of Europe to maybe try and force President Zelensky to the negotiating table, but the US and the UK are having none of that. They want to make sure that that support can continue and that any decisions about Ukraine's territorial integrity are made by Ukraine alone.
I know now you spoke about some special guests. Who are those guests and why those countries in particular?
Yeah, so President Ramaphosa will be joining the leaders of India, Indonesia, Senegal as special guests at this conference, and that is because certainly from the G7's perspective, those are countries that they see as really key and critical for that kind of global club of democracies, if you will. Of course, South Africa and India in particular playing a pretty important role of almost being on both sides, if you will. Of course, members of the BRICS organisation, but also very close to G7 member countries. And so I think it will be a real concerted effort on the parts of both the German host and other G7 countries to work very closely with South Africa. Certainly government officials I've spoken to in Berlin in recent weeks tell me that they see South Africa not just as a really key partner as a fellow democracy, but also a really key partner in the Africa Union. And they want to make sure that if decisions are made about helping Africa as a whole, that Joburg and Cape Town have a pretty significant say in how that help is given out, given their expertise in the region.
Speaking of that, Trent, are there any bilateral meetings for President Cyril Ramaphosa at the back of this?
Yeah, we do, and we're still awaiting official confirmation on what those will be. What we do know is that from tomorrow, President Ramaphosa will have the opportunity to sit down face-to-face with the likes of President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he joins the summit. He is leading the South African delegation in two particular sessions taking place tomorrow. One is titled Investing in the Future, which is all about trying to promote equity and gender equality, as well as health. And then there will be another session as well on food security and climate change. So South Africa bringing a pretty big delegation to those discussions to make sure, again, that the voice of not just South Africa, but the African continent as a whole is heard. He will also be joined, I should mention, by a big delegation from Senegal. We expect those two delegations to work quite closely during this summit to present a fairly united front on behalf of all those other countries that they are representing in many ways.
Trent Murray, live for us there at the G7 Leaders Summit. Thanks very much indeed for your time. We'll be touching base with you at a later on, of course, indeed, to talk more about that.